4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Sterling. I am a member of Black Funders St. Louis. I'd like to welcome you to session 5 of the 2020 Black Philanthropy Month Lunch and Learn 6-part webinar series. This event is obviously presented by Black Funders of St. Louis. We're a local giving circle. Our members are Black people from all walks of life who agree to make an annual contribution of $300 or more. That money is pooled together with donations from non-members and allies of racial equity to award grants to Black-led nonprofits in St. Louis every year. Since 2014, we have awarded more than $10,000 to local nonprofits. In addition, members are encouraged to offer their time and talent to support Black-led nonprofits in the community. Our work is rooted firmly in the pursuit of racial equity and the fair of St. Louis. If you'd like to learn more about us, our grant making, the concept of giving circles, this webinar series, you can visit our website, which is blackfundersstl.com. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge our fiscal sponsor, Deaconess Foundation, which is providing technical assistance for this call and for all of the webinar events during the series. A couple of housekeeping things. At the bottom of the screen, you'll notice there's a Q&A box and a chat box. The Q&A box is where you ask questions. If we have time, we will get to as many questions as we can. Otherwise, enjoy the conversation. There is a chat box where you can have more informal discussions. This is being live broadcasted on Deaconess's YouTube channel. Today's session plus last Thursday's session will be posted on Black Funders of St. Louis's YouTube channel later this week and on our website. With that, I'd like to move into today's topic, which is civic engagement and voting. I thought that before I introduce the panelists, I'd offer a little context, and then we'll see how well I did when we get to the panelists. From my perspective, at its heart, civic engagement is about concerning oneself with the basic and sometimes critical activities that really hold society together. That might include, but is not limited to, crime, public safety, taxes, economic growth, housing, education, and of course, our rights as citizens. The topic of voting has never been more popular and controversial. I think in recent years, we've seen probably an increase in allegations of voter suppression and tampering, but also we've seen more people talk about the power of voting and how it leads to change. Probably the best examples are the election of Barack Obama and the election of Donald Trump. Today, we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic and global protests around issues like racial equity, the conduct of law enforcement officers and elected officials. And it feels like there's never been more correlation between traditional civic engagement, community organizing, voting, and social justice than it has been in a very, very long time, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm gonna start with introductions. First, we have Don Calloway, who's the CEO and founder of Pine Street Strategies, where he leads the firm's tax, congressional advocacy, and media production practices. He offers overall strategic direction, advising corporations, nonprofits, and political clients on congressional, regulatory, and political climates. He has led federal regulatory and congressional affairs for Anheuser-Busch in DC. Before that, he was a member of the Missouri House of Representatives, and he also was a senior associate specializing in business litigation practice at Thompson Coburn. He's been responsible for leading defense verdicts at the federal and state level for product liability, medical malpractice, and commercial disputes. If Don's face looks familiar, but you don't feel like you've met him, it's because you've probably seen him or heard him on MSNBC, Fox News, or Sirius XM Radio. Next, we have Kimberly Gardner, who is our first African-American to head the St. Louis City Circuit Attorney's Office. Ms. Gardner has worked at Bell, Kirksey & Associates. She was also an assistant prosecutor. from 2005 to 2010 before being elected to the Circuit Attorney's Office. From 2013 to 2017, she was a Missouri State Representative for the District 77. Her stated goals have been to transform the justice system in the city to make it fair for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or orientation. Looking at policies that address crime at its root rather than its symptoms, greater accountability for law enforcement, and using incarceration as a last resort for true offenders rather than punishing people who may be too poor to post bail for simple or minor crimes. We have Kayla Reed. She is a Black, queer organizer and strategist from right here in St. Louis, Missouri. After the killing of Michael Brown, she got involved in organizing around issues of racial justice, economic justice, and policing. She's the co-founder and director of Action St. Louis, which is a grassroots organization building Black political power here in St. Louis. Action St. Louis has led campaigns to elect progressive candidates to local office, pass local and state policies, and has been a prominent leading force in the Close the Workhouse campaign and is working to end cash bail. Kayla is also a lead strategist for the Movement for Black Lives, where she co-founded the National Electoral Justice Project. And finally, we're not sure if Rasheen is going to be able to hop on the call, but I'm going to read his bio. He's in Jeff City today. He didn't expect that until recently. Rasheen Aldridge is a community organizer and activist. He has served as the director of Young Activists United St. Louis. He was also the student co-chair of Missouri Jobs for Justice. Rasheen was the youngest member of the Ferguson Commission, where he advocated for greater accountability and oversight of law enforcement, something he continues to do with Expect Us, which is a diverse collaboration of activists that have hosted daytime rallies in places like Brentwood, downtown St. Louis, Clayton, and St. Charles to protest racism, police brutality, and the recent deaths of African Americans like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. In 2019, Rasheen was elected to represent District 78 in Missouri House of Representatives. Whew, that was a mouthful. How is everybody?
Very well. Thank you for having us.
Good. So I'm going to hop in. I'm just going to hop right into it. So you heard my definition of civic engagement as well as my take on the climate surrounding voting right now. My question to you is, am I on the mark? Is that a fair definition of civic engagement? I'll start with you, Don.
Yeah, I think that you are spot on. I think that voting is a cornerstone of civic engagement, and I could say a whole lot of other things that everybody's already heard on that. But the reality is, at the moment, that people like Kayla and organizers of her caliber, of which there are very few, but people who are really doing the work like that around the country are recognizing that voting is not sufficiently cathartic of an activity to meet the moment of pain that Black people are in nationwide. So voting, I think as we move from the respectability politics phase of our journey of the African in America, and we move towards the immediacy and demand phase, we have to recognize that voting is essential, voting is a cornerstone, but voting is only a part of our liberative journey. And that is a very harsh reality to come to. It involves unlearning a lot of things that we've been taught about voting being the key to us, to liberative activity as Black people. Voting is essential. I am not here to ever diminish the importance of voting, diminish the urgency of voting, but voting can no longer be the only part of the demands that we have to exist as a free and fully self-actualized people. Even if we are to elect a Black woman president, even if we elect Joe Biden, I do believe in the stopping the harm reduction. So we have to get Trump out of there, right? But even if we are to elect Biden-Harris, there are arguments to be made that we are changing out the pharaoh of an oppressive system. We are not fully liberated. We are not fully free after 8 years of a Black man being president who, in my lifetime, I believe was the best president. So even if carried out at its most effective on the federal level and every level underneath that, we have to continue to vote But I think we also have to continue to organize. We have to make sure that in our interpersonal relationships, we are affirming Black lives and all human life, really, in every facet. But I do think that, of course, voting is sufficient. But I think that organizing and affirmation of actual individual lives and collective existences is just as important as voting.
So Kayla, I got a question for you. What's the role of those of us, the folks watching, who aren't elected officials, who aren't political strategists, who aren't activists? What's our role? And maybe even beyond voting, what's our role?
Yeah. So, I think to in part answer the first question and tie it into the second is that civic engagement is an entire journey. It's an entire ecosystem, an apparatus of different systems that overlap and touch each other. Part of the reason that I helped to start the Electoral Justice Project with the Movement for Black Lives, and part of the reason that Action is really dedicated to the idea of democracy expansion and electoral justice, is because we reduce the entire conversation to voting, which is one person, one vote. But there's a system that creates the conditions and how, why, and where, and when, and who can actually vote. And so for us, it's time to look at kind of a structural analysis of the electoral system. And the reason we frame it as electoral justice is because, as every other system in this country is deeply racialized, so is our electoral system. And in order for us to have a real solid framework on what it means to actually get people to civically engage, we have to hold a structural analysis on the ways in which people are disenfranchised and marginalized and intentionally left out of the process. And so, we always have this kind of GOTV mentality in this country, the last 10 days before an election, the last 2 weeks before the election. But the making of that election is years and decades of policies and decisions that hinder or make it more easy for certain people to access the ballot. There are structures that lead into how, the Electoral College creates an unfair outcome in smaller states having disproportionate representation in the total, conversation on president. The census has massive implications on legislative districts in our state. The city as it stands right now is supposed to reduce from 28 wards to 14. Missouri is one of the few states that allows early voting, non-excuse absentee, and we don't have automatic voter registration. We have over 80,000 people in this state who cannot vote simply because they have a felony. They've served their time, but they cannot access the vote. They cannot access the vote. And that is not even talking about the range of ways in which people who are not citizens are taxed and impacted by policy, but have no pathway to actually engaging in the structures that impact their daily lives. So for us, when we talk about civic engagement, we are talking about the individual role that people can take. We are also talking about the structures that create the conditions in which actions are limited. How that works for individuals is that, part of any, the reason that we named our organization Action St. Louis is because anyone can take action toward change and toward building political power. You don't have to be an electoral strategist to understand the conditions of your city, to understand the importance of the circuit attorney, to understand the levers in which in St. Louis City, the board of ENA is made up of 3 people, and those votes happen in various years. And they have different influence over things like the budget and policies that are implemented. You don't have to be an activist to tell people to fill out their census. We are severely at an undercount right now in St. Louis. And part of the work that Action is doing in a pandemic, in a modern civil rights movement, is getting back on the doors without any grant funding, with our unrestricted general operating money, to do another pass to make sure people are completing the census, because the implications on that are far beyond anything that could be restricted by if we did or did not receive funding, because the power and the resources that our communities will lose are at stake. And so for me, as someone who's in the conversation, if you commit to taking daily action in service of Black political power, in service of Black lives, there's something for you to do every day, because there are way too many systems that are impacting our abilities to actually build communities that are fully civically engaged. And if you decide to take an action, whether that's sharing a post, reading an article, making a donation, volunteering, or voting, I assure you that every day of the year there's an activity in which you can act toward improving our material conditions.
Hey, Kim, I'd like you to jump in on this part of the conversation too. And I guess this is a good time to say congratulations because you just won the Democratic primary. Your mic is still off. It's bottom left.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So as somebody who's very recently went through this process that we're talking about, I want to know what it's like to be in your situation, and also, you know, if there's something that you want to say to the average Black person out there about voting, about the political process, about ways that they can prepare themselves, you know, to really execute their duty as citizens, and what kind of impact they can have. Maybe.
Well, I think that we see, I'm still running, so I have a general. So I have a Democratic primary, but now I do have a general. And so we still have to continue to vote and go to the polls November 3rd. But, you know, when I hear Don, I hear Kayla, advocacy is important in terms of being the elected prosecutor in the city of St. Louis and dealing with the issues of reforming a system that we all know needs to be dismantled and rebuilt, the criminal justice system. And I believe what we saw in my election and many other elections, we have a new congresswoman. We have seen the energizing of activism to address the issues that people want to deal with. This police accountability. People are saying enough is enough with the issues of the criminal justice system and how we can vote and go to the polls. And I think that we as engaged people need to energize young people to go out to exercise their right to vote, because we saw I was elected in 2016, took office in 2017. And again, the people of the city of St. Louis reelected me in August 4th, overwhelmingly, but we still have to go to the polls because what is at stake right now is voter suppression. We have people like President Donald Trump. We saw the Republican National Convention talking about taking it back to a way of life that I don't know is inclusive of all people. Right. And really is to silence and cause fear, and how we want safety in our communities. We want advocacy in our communities. We want police accountability in our communities, because what is at stake is all of our quality of life. And I believe that voting is essential. I believe we have to do a better job of energizing all people to come out to vote. We have to energize people to come out November 3rd in this dangerous pandemic, where we have to prepare for issues with absentee voting. We have to prepare for vote early so we can avoid lines and make sure we appropriately social distance. I think we have to educate people to come out and to exercise their right, because that right is important. And we are dealing with things that are so important right now, where we have a president who wants to put out misinformation about voter suppression. We have other people who follow them, like in our state house, the Missouri Governor Mike Parsons and the Attorney General Eric Schmidt, who will try to suppress the people, particularly in the city of St. Louis, who they vote for as a prosecutor. They're willing to suppress a vote by legislative maneuvers that they're going to continue to try going forward in the future. And so we have to watch this, but we have to vote, because if we don't exercise our right to vote, we're allowing these same powerful few of individuals to keep things from staying the same. And if you want reform, we're here. Well, let's make sure we have people in place that can help us enact the reform, because we have people on the state level as well as the federal level who want to create mass incarceration 2020, and that's what's at stake.
So I want to come back to this concept of change in a minute, but I want to reflect on something that I saw that you said recently, Don, that I thought was really interesting, and something I had been feeling, but I hadn't really verbalized it yet. You offered up the idea on Facebook that some of our civil servants need to become conscientious objectors. And I'd like you to, you got your sound is off, but I'd like you to expound on that a little bit, that this concept that I think a lot of times there's this group of people we don't even think about. We think about voters, we think about elected officials, maybe we think about activists. There's a whole other group of people who are involved in this process.
Yeah, so that's a fact. You know, when you think about the phrase conscientious objectors, that goes back to, you hear it a lot in Vietnam when people who conscientiously objected to going to serve in the military or whatnot. You know, Muhammad Ali famously said, "I don't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." And that was probably one of the more, you know, famous examples of the phrase conscientious objector. But I live here in DC, and I see every day, you encounter every day, the people who are actually the glue and who make federal government happen, the things we take for granted, right? The things that not only the mail coming every day, but your Social Security check showing up on time, or various offices and bureaus that all of us rely on every day being open and doing their jobs that kind of push this American life forward. And I think that I was speaking specifically in that Facebook post to the concept of what happens after November 4th, between November 4th and January 19th. But as we've seen over the course of the last week, it's actually applicable to even now before the election. I was talking specifically between November 4th and January 19th because we know that this president will not accept the results of the election. And we already know that him to be incredibly dangerous and unmoored. So what will happen between the day after the election and the inauguration, noon on January 20th, when he still has the awesome galvanized powers of the most powerful office in the world at his fingertips? What does he owe to Putin? Will he will still have the codes? So on a very literal level, I was thinking about actors in the military objecting to his unjust orders that may come during that period of time. But also, I think it's a lot broader than that in the retrospect since I posted it, whereas we see the actual tampering with mail service right now to slow down electoral processes, and that is a complete aberration of electoral justice. But if you think about it, you could say that the president is tampering with the mail service, and he is. You could say that Louis DeJoy, the Postmaster General, is sabotaging electoral processes through the mail, and he is. But somebody, somewhere, and actual multiple bodies had to go in and remove those voting machines. Somebody had to, and in the voting machines that are offline, I have several friends who are sending me pictures of machines being kind of discarded and pulled up to the side. You can't just plug them back in because they have removed component parts from machines. And we're seeing packages pile up. We're seeing perishables rot. We're seeing people not get prescriptions that are still delivered through the mail. I think 30 million Americans still rely on prescriptions through the United States Postal Service. So I think that when I say conscientious objectors, it's actually much broader than even I imagined when I wrote that post. You have to have somebody who says, "Nah, I'm not going to dismantle this mail sorting machine because that's an unjust order. I'm not going to launch this nuclear missile on November 19th just because the president is bitter and angry and wants to tear the whole thing down with him in his loss." So there's an entire universe where we will see the opportunity to stand up and do what's right. But it should be noted that conscientious objecting, standing up in the face of authority, defying unjust orders, has kind of been the story of Black people from our beginnings. Nat Turner and slave rebellions. Muhammad Ali, like I mentioned, not going to fight in an unjust Vietnam War. College students in the late 1980s, I remember a very special episode. I guess every episode was very special, of A Different World, about divesting from South Africa and boycotting the Shell oil company when there weren't a whole lot of different options for gas at the time. So I'm calling for a lot of people over the course of, this moment we're in to be conscientious objectors. But really, that ain't nothing new to Black folks. And it's kind of the story of our existence here in America.
So, man, when I read that this morning, it opened up so much for me. I think
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I mean, I agree with what Don is saying, but we have to have conscientious objectors, even locally, to really to really make what he's saying a reality to a lot of local levels. And when we see, and what I've disturbed at is when you see a lot of good people fail to act, that's the problem. It's not the words of our enemy, it's the silence of our friends. And we have a lot of people who are caught in this narrative, this conundrum of doing the right thing. And it's regardless of your party, regardless of your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. We have a lot of people that are okay with sitting silent and knowing that we are hurting many people. Like Don is saying, the mail is stopping with delivering medicine. I mean, it's people who are suffering in this pandemic, delivering medicine, delivering basic necessities that we all know that we need. But we're caught in this political pandering of I guess, authoritarianism that the Trump wants to perpetuate. But where are these like-minded individuals on whatever side of the party who wants to do what's right for all of their constituents, who use the mail? But that's this clique of Trumptonian behavior that I believe is so detrimental and which is so disturbing, that the RNC perpetuated yesterday, which was disturbing fear and divisive and racism. It's disgusting that no one is calling out, when good people fail to act. I mean, enough is enough. This is not about activism. This is about people standing up for what's right. And we all deserve to have our mail run. We all deserve to not be lied to. We all deserve to have a president who has failed us all in this deadly pandemic, and African Americans are dying more than anybody. And in the city of St. Louis and the St. Louis region, we have higher concentrations of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis here. And people are losing their jobs, losing their lives. And we have no one in that White House that is standing up and saying, hey, we see people suffering, we're gonna do the right thing. We are having people make up treatments, make up protocols, make up lies, and everybody's okay with lies and misinformation. So I'm with Don. We have to have good people stand up and fight for what's right and call truth to power.
The thing that she's absolutely right. And the last thing I would suggest that I did.
I was about to get there.
We're gonna get you, Kayla.
The last thing I would suggest on that I forgot to mention, but that Kim makes a great point. We know who we need and we know what people need to do, but it takes courage. And that's easy to say, but it's very difficult to put into practice. It takes courage. You might get fired from that cushy corporate job. You might get dismissed from school. You might go to jail. You could be killed. And we lionize our heroes in because history treats them more kind than in the storybooks than it actually did at the time. We just buried John Lewis. John Lewis went to jail. Like, he sat in jail 80 times. That wasn't fun. John Lewis almost died on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. That wasn't enjoyable. I mean, think, when the last time you've been hit? Like, he almost died. He was almost beaten to death. It takes courage. It takes someone who is willing to sacrifice. And honestly, I think that a lot of us, particularly, middle class, upper middle class African Americans, have gotten real comfortable, and we have forgotten the meaning of courage. Muhammad Ali, one of my great heroes, I have his face tattooed on my arm. He lost it all. At the height of it all, walked away from it all, lost it all because he chose to be a conscientious objector. So again, that's why I just have tremendous respect for the Kayla Reeds of the world, for the Circuit Attorney Gardners of the world, who have decided that even in the face of these potential disastrous circumstances for my family, for my house, for my cushy life, I'm willing to make courageous decisions to sacrifice for the overall liberation of Black people.
Kayla?
Yeah, I was going to say that, that conversation about people being idle, complicit bystanders, that's not limited to the conversation around the president or Congress, right? That's Jefferson City. There are Democrats that supported bills that would have stripped away Circuit Attorney Gardner's power, that would have created a reality where children who are 12 or 14 are able to be certified as adults. And our Democrats voted for that, right? We live in a city right now where a judge had to tell the city that they can no longer evict, like they're not going to allow them to evict people during the pandemic. We had to negotiate for an additional $2 million to be added to support folks' rents and mortgage payments. And we know that there was only one very small check from Congress, and people have been unemployed since March, and children are going back to school. And we're having conversations about, you know, if the county bought TVs, right? And testing sites. We're still not getting rapid response testing sites. We're still not getting the things that we need. And folks, they pick and choose their battle because they're not thinking about the entire collective. And we don't have a collective, you know, this is a Black funder space. I know it's being broadcast to YouTube, but if we're talking about Black political power, if we're talking about mitigating harm for Black communities, hyper concentrated in parts of South City and in North City and in North County, that we have to have unwavering non-negotiables. They have to be clear lines that our children are not up for grabs, that our communities are not up for grabs. You know what I thought of first when they talked about the post office? The thousands of families in this region who have built a middle-class life, a retirement package, family, like wealth, generational wealth, because someone got that good government job down at the post office and they opened the door for their nephew to do the same. Everybody got an auntie that works for the post office. It's not a joke. You know, it's like, it's not real. It's like, it's Black culture that someone in your family works for the USPS. And by reducing and breaking that system apart, he is also sending a clear message that he is not, this is the same president who says the Black unemployment rate is the lowest in the country. Meanwhile, USPS is one of the largest employers in the country. And you're cutting that. And Black workers are overrepresented in that system because the private sector never made space for us after the Civil Rights Act is passed. So we relied on good government jobs, city hall jobs. We relied on the USPS. And by dismantling that system, you are breaking apart Black economic stability. And then that's going to transfer into low civic engagement rates. People aren't voting not just because of the fallacies and the problems with the two-party system, and there are plenty. They're not voting because they haven't changed their address because they're transient. They're not voting because they don't know that there's an August election, because we spend more money in November than we do in August and March. They don't know that the ballot initiative is actually about the letter that they got that kicked their kids off Medicaid, that we're trying to expand it. They don't know that Republicans are trying to draw maps without counting non-citizens or children, which will completely gut political power in our cities. No one's talking to them except the organizations, and Black organizations just started to get funding in the last 6 years. And it's still a fraction.
Woefully low.
It's still a fraction of the larger nonprofit apparatus. And so for us, it is really about connecting these issues. People connected that they saw the Close the Workhouse campaign and they saw Kim Gardner. They connected that. People said, as an organizer who worked to close the workhouse every single day of my life for the last 3 years, I am perfectly fine with somebody being like, Kim Gardner closed the workhouse, we got to reelect her. Fine, absolutely, please. However, whatever's going to get you in line. But we spend money to get them at the top ticket. We do not invest in the down ballot. We do not connect these issues. We are not talking about the fact that Eric Schmidt and the Attorney General and Governor Parson are trying to pass amendments that would give him unilateral decision-making to remove a prosecutor from their seat. We're not talking about the fact that Kansas City doesn't have control over their police department, that the police union is circumventing. We have more feds in the city right now than we've had in a decade because the police union is circumventing the circuit attorney to take cases to the feds. We know that the charges are harder, the sentencing is harder. These are young people who are typically between 18 and 25. Their brains aren't finished developing, but we're about to send them to a max security prison because a political warfare is happening. And people feel it because they see their children getting locked up. And people feel it because they see themselves getting stopped by the police. But we don't connect it to the ballot. We just say, people die for the right to do it, you should go do it. And when we get out of that, what Don mentioned, that respectability messaging, and we actually connect the issues on the ballot to people's lived experience, it can help them change their material conditions.
So I want to make an observation and then ask a question. So it seems like one of the challenges is that a lot of the dialogue that happens around politics and civic engagement is really a series of code words and in some cases just cynicism, but mostly code words. You know, for example, saying I'm tough on crime means something depending on who's saying it, right? In a lot of communities, I'm tough on crime really means I'm going to put the hatchet to Black people, right? And what's interesting is that I saw something in the Washington Post that said that even though we spend a lot of time talking about gun violence in the Black community, matter of fact, I wrote this stat down. I'm going to read it for you guys because I want to get it absolutely right. That the majority of gun deaths in the United States are not homicides, but suicides, and that white men account for 74% of them, which I thought was really interesting, right? I feel like a lot of this is a battle of words and slick conversation and messaging, and the question becomes is how does the average person sift through this to find the truth, right? And you know, the other question I really wanted to ask is, do we underestimate our power as Black voters and as Black constituents? You know, do we have more power than we wield?
Yes.
Is that one of the symptoms of being caught in the politics of respectability?
I don't think it's,
Because it seems like it seems like when it's a problem and it's our problem, it gets blasted everywhere. It seems like sometimes when it's a problem that many people have, the attention is still on us. If you look at the quote that I just read from the Washington Post, it says there's more gun-related deaths are assigned to suicide than actual homicide. And that 74%.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, both of you, just jump in.
Well, I just want to say, to piggyback off of what you're saying and what Kayla's saying, I mean, one of the things that we have more power if we exercise our right, but we have to have someone like the activists and organizations to really have a message, like Kayla is saying, to energize people to really understand what is going on. Right now, we have the powerful few who create this narrative of tough on crime rhetoric, where this is the same war on drugs. This is the same rhetoric that politics have been based on to keep things the same way. And we are dealing with the effects of mass incarceration that has been the problem for flawed policies for decades. The same thing with what Kayla's talking about, where now the same perpetrator on misinformation and lies, William Barr, is using the DOJ with President Donald Trump to attack cities where they say Democrats have power. And so they're using this fear of mass incarceration, the tough on crime, we're going to make your city safer, when none of these federal agents are going to address violent crime in the city of St. Louis, when most of the violent crime is unsolved. And most people fail to address the mistrust with the whole criminal justice system. And so it's this fear rhetoric that I believe the media sometimes plays with, creating this message of fear and divisiveness. And we never have a counter balance of this story. That's why Black media, I think alternative media that gives a voice to the alternative message of how do we make our city safer and how we energize people to come out to vote. Like Kayla is saying, that it's about the quality of life, that I believe that when we have systemic racism that's been perpetuated in the criminal justice system, as well as policing in communities that need police the most, and we have this message of fear and distrust, and when African Americans and people of color are represented more in the criminal justice system, it's this rhetoric that we can identify certain groups, but which crime is affecting all of us. And we have to address how we make everyone in the community feel safe. And that's where this narrative of fear plays to a base of holding on to the status quo. And I think in Missouri, particularly in the city of St. Louis and the state of Missouri, the fear of the powerful few, which, you know, Trump has used our state as a battleground of fear and divisive rhetoric. We're in the media, well, not for good reasons. We're in the media as showing to keep a way of life that has made our cities less safe. And this fear of political pandering that's pushed from the president to our governor is a problem, because I'm saying, why is it okay to a lot of people and have zero success? No one asked them, okay, bring in federal agents. What are you going to do? They're not addressing violent crime. They're addressing felons in possession. A person who had a prior felony case and has a gun. So that's not a person who's shooting someone. Actually, there's no federal statute for murder. So they're not going to solve these murder cases. They're not going to solve these violent cases. It's the rhetoric that we're going to have more policing equals safer cities, which that is not the case, because we have a lot of police in the city of St. Louis. We have over 1,200 police officers, and we have less than 300,000 people. And if you look at comparisons to other cities, we have more police than some cities, and we're still not safe. So what is it? Why is this rhetoric okay with zero success? And everybody holds on to this tough on crime rhetoric that has zero results, zero success. But when you talk about reform, that's letting everybody go. When you're talking about helping build healthy communities and be preventative, you're not about addressing violent crime. It's this narrative of holding on to a way that, to me, we know we have no results, but we need people like Kayla and people like yourself to get out the right information. Because in Missouri, we gutted our gun laws. That governor and that attorney general, they were the ones, when they were senators, that took the vote to make us an open carry, permitless, stand your ground state. And then they have the nerve to talk about they want to address violent crime in the city of St. Louis, where, by the way, in the city alone, the tool used the most in violent crime is a gun.
And white people and black people that exercise open carry or concealed carry are treated differently in St. Louis. I know this for a fact. I witnessed it this morning. A white guy didn't get any feedback at all. And I know black people that get feedback on that for sure. Go ahead, Kayla.
Yeah, I think, we have to kind of break open this like binary conversation on violence, because it's limiting. What is violent is white supremacy. White supremacy is violent. The conditions in North City, how every house that I lived in before I was 10 no longer stands in North City, that's violent, right? The lack of health care and access to doctors, public schools, that is violence. And that is state sanctioned and controlled violence. And the reason that we have such a hyper concentration on the reason that we do this kind of black on black narrative, I'm pointing at the right hand so you can't see what the left hand is doing. Violence doesn't happen. They're not out of control levels of shooting in Chesterfield or high numbers of police in Chesterfield, because there are resources in Chesterfield. Right. And we keep doing the exact same thing. In 1993, the Fed program came to St. Louis. In the early 2000s, the Fed program came to St. Louis. Every summer, the Missouri State Highway Patrol comes to St. Louis, and they stop people and they recover a couple of guns, not in the act of anything that is going on, not in the midst of a shooting. No one's jumping in front of a child to take a bullet to save a life. We're talking about catching people who have drugs and a gun and saying we're making the streets safer. And that is, to me, it's a narrative, it's propaganda. It allows us to not have a structural analysis. And we do the same thing with voting. We talk about, if y'all don't turn out to vote, that's why stuff looks the way that it is. No, that is not true. Because even when we voted high turnout, the conditions of structures existed beyond our control, like what we can and cannot control. And so for us at Action, and my work as an organizer is, again, to really connect that. We talk about budgets like we talk about paychecks, because it's something that we need to talk about. It needs to be something that everyday people know, that the city of St. Louis, in the face of violence, in the face of all these reports, Ferguson Commission, For the Sake of All, Health Equity Works, Dismantling the Divide, whatever SLU has put out, all these reports say the exact same thing. And we got this buzzword, racial equity. We got it in 2014. People latched onto it in rhetoric, but not in action. And so what we know that North City needs is a large infusion of resources, and a large and consistent infusion of resources. But we can't make resources appear out of thin air. So where do we keep seeing increases? Even in a pandemic, The only department that didn't take a hit in the entire in the pandemic are the police. That's the only department that saw an increase in this personnel. We have this ridiculous number of authorized force of 1,300 that puts our per capita above cities like Chicago and DC. And we're not seeing a return on anything. And then when the investigations fall short and when no one's convicted, we're going to blame the circuit attorney. But if Kim would have lost and Mary Pat would have won and Mary Pat couldn't get a high conviction rate, we would turn that as we would blame the victims for not coming forward. The buck is always passed to protect white supremacy. It's always passed to insulate the actual parties that need to be held accountable for what is happening in St. Louis. And we spend millions of dollars evading that accountability. We give permission, we divide the ballot. We put 15, I'm so terrified for the mayor's, actually I'm not terrified, I'm angry at the potential of the mayor's race in 2021, because we saw what we did in 2017 when there was not a collective vision, when there was not a collective plan. We allowed a mayor with a fraction of the city to control the city budget and city hall for 4 years. And what has she done for North City? What has happened for Black children? And we don't have that conversation. We talk about voting, but we don't talk about politics. And voting is political. It's political on who gets to vote. So we have to talk about the implications of the politics right away. If you connect those issues to people's everyday lives, this Operation Legend is terrifying. They named it after a Black child, and that Black child lived in a neighborhood where there was not resources to make sure that he had access to food and quality housing. But they named a program to lock up more Black children after this Black child, to say that they care about us. And what they're going to do is send these young people to federal prison, circumventing the will of voters in St. Louis who elected a reform-minded prosecutor to institute diversion programs, to combat mandatory minimums. They're circumventing her. And we sent a resounding message on August 4th that we wanted to keep the plan that we instituted in 2016. And what happened the next day? The Senate bill gets introduced. There's a press conference to bring in Operation Legend. Who's at that press conference? The governor, who's on the ballot in November, and the mayor, who's on the ballot in March. And you have to connect these issues if we really want to talk about civic engagement and we really want to talk about power.
And Kayla, don't forget, Attorney General Eric Schmidt was there.
Also on the ballot in November.
Never elected. Public Safety Director Jimmy Edwards.
Don't even want to talk about that.
The police.
But can I just say, look, Eric Schmidt and I practiced law together way back in the day. We went to Jeff City together.
Don't repeat that too loud.
Listen.
He need to lose his license. I'm gonna say that.
We went to Jeff together back in the day, and the reality is that we, all of Missouri, but even prominently Democrats, African American Democrats, have given people like that a pass. Why? Because he's a clean-cut family man from suburban St. Louis. He's from Kirkwood. He's not one of the crazies. No. I don't want to see him in the hood participating in nobody's cleanup when his policies are derogatory to Black people. And we have to really stop playing around the margins, playing around the edges, stop giving people safe cover. And that's people of any party. Stop giving them safe cover when their actual policy is harmful, derogatory, violent, murderous to marginalized people, most of whom happen to be Black and brown. Let's have a real conversation here. I mean, everybody's kind of building up to it, but the reality is what we're talking about is it time to fundamentally replant this thing? Because if you do that, then no concept can be off the table in terms of what we are courageous enough to discuss. If you consider the political concepts of the Overton windows, Overton window basically meaning what is acceptable to talk about from a policy perspective. And over time, as you talk about these ideas, as you challenge the status quo, that eventually translates into policy which pushes the world forward. We have to be courageous enough to have discussions that amount to not just playing at the margins, not just changing our faces in leadership, even if they're Black faces, but challenging fundamentally the system that we live in. Kayla alluded to it earlier. When you're talking about voting, even if all Black people came out to vote, you have to be able to have the courage to have the conversation about why Wyoming has the same 2 Senate votes that California has. If you're talking about opportunity and resources and jobs coming to North St. Louis, you have to have the courage to even start the conversations about, wait, is capitalism, is unchecked, unharnessed capitalism the best possible system, the most equitable system for everyone to have a fair opportunity in this country? If you look at all of the progress that's been made, not in ancient history, but in our lifetimes, it's because people have been willing to intellectually innovate and philosophically create and push that Overton window in the direction of progress and, frankly, in the direction of justice. Because you said earlier, Brandon, your first question, and we've had a lot of conversations since the question, but you said, what can ordinary people do? I think that ordinary people need to detach ourselves from political affiliation, detach ourselves from aspiration and not only respectability politics, but detach ourselves from our safe zones and say, hey, what is the problem here? What is the pain here? And let me walk that backwards to find what policy issues we can work on to fix that pain. We talk about all the time, Democrats, every Democrat in this country at every level will run on a platform saying and I do say he because dudes aren't that creative, will run on a platform talking about affordable health care. Well, I don't want to hear about affordable health care because cheap health care is still not fair. I want to talk about free health care as a human right. And that's the conversation we should be having. And I'm not a Bernie bro. That's the conversation we should be having. We should be talking about committing ourselves to re-examining every single aspect of the American experiment. The problem is that politics punishes failure, and innovation guarantees that failure will happen to some degree. But we have to be courageous enough to fail if we're going to recreate ourselves into a society where everyone has a chance to be fully self-actualized and fully have a free and fair life within the context of this country. And that's far beyond.
Does the average person have a responsibility to understand policy?
Yes,
I think
to some extent.
Policy impacts them.
I think the average person has a responsibility to imagine a fair world.
Yes.
And if you want to do that through the policy lens, great. If you want to do that through charity lens, great. But I think that an average person has a responsibility to themselves and their kids and their fellow person to use their brains that God has given them to imagine a situation that's better than what we have right now.
Absolutely.
So,
and I think it's important to say, I really like this idea of imagining things, and we don't have to look far to imagine them. We imagine that we would close a jail.
That's right.
Can tell you when we sat down with this 2 years
That's
ago,
right.
it was like, I'm with y'all, but how you gonna make that happen? And it was like, we're gonna navigate it one person at a time, and it became such a powerful campaign that it decided elections. It had implications because people were starting to imagine, these young people aren't just talking about closing the jail. We're talking about moving $16 million into a reimagining public safety fund.
That's right.
Completely decided by the people who live in the communities that are most impacted by violence. Not to be made political chips to be bargained away, not for favors to be given or people to create voting blocks on how the money gets spent, but everyday people getting to come into a space to say, we want to cure violence in our community. We actually want to create more infrastructure to combat speeding because we're having a lot of hit and runs in our community. We actually want to create, we want to get some of these problematic properties. We either want to rebuild them or we want to tear them down, but actually giving folks the power to step into it. People know what they need. And politics create this situation where we say in the city of St. Louis, 28 people from very different backgrounds and very different lived experiences can tell you what 300,000 people need. And that is not how democracy should work. People should be in consistent communication with their elected official. They should be able to say, hey, you did something that we didn't like. hey, this is the agenda that we want you to put forward, and they should work toward that every single day. We don't have a system of co-governance in this region. We have a system of vote for me and then ask me no questions until I come around to ask you to vote for me again. And that system leaves our folks out, it leaves us behind, and it leaves us in the way of harm. And we're really trying to get at combating that every step of the way. We just got city hall meetings televised. You can't go on the Board of Aldermen website and see how people vote on a bill. There's no way for us to do report cards without having to go down to the archives to manage to see what bills are even introduced. The summaries of bills are insufficient. There's, aldermen don't regularly have town halls where they're doing canvassing to talk to people between elections. State reps don't do debriefs of what's happening in the state legislature. But then when there's a bill that's egregious, it's like, oh, we need everyone to respond. But there were a lot of bills that were not okay that we just didn't talk about at all. And it's like, we have to build the infrastructure to bring people into it. They want to know what's going on. They absolutely want to know what's going on. They're not too busy to understand that wasn't there and now it's there. How did it get there? They want to know that. They want to know why the school closed. They want to know why there's no COVID testing site.
So let me ask you two questions.
And we have to build those systems to help that infrastructure to talk to people more regularly.
So I have two questions for you. The first being, when we talk about, and I'm switching gears a little bit, when we talk about privilege within the Black community, and I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit, Don, as middle class, upper middle class people, we start thinking about our homes and our 401k and our job and our SUV and all that stuff. Are we sharing power, and are we listening well enough to those among us that are more vulnerable? That's the first half of the question. The second half of the question, it's funny, I was on the fence of whether I would ask this question, and then earlier you said, we kind of dancing it around. Do we need a Black agenda?
Okay, so the question of, are we sharing power? No, of course not. You knew that before you asked. Power concedes nothing without a demand. So of course we're not sharing power. I would even argue.
And is that a part of the disconnect too? Is that why some people don't want to vote? Because we do this hierarchy thing where it's by color, then it's by wealth, in terms of who gets access to leaders, etc.
Yeah, well, I think that's definitely why some people don't want to vote, but that's a smaller part of the larger experiment, which is why some people feel disconnected and disengaged and feel as though this country does not have a place for them, fundamentally, right? They feel as though the deck is stacked. They feel as though the ceiling on their personal self-actualization has already long since been set. But when you're talking about cushiness and respectability politics, I think we've hit on that theme a couple of times, but specifically to your question, I have started in my professional life and in my personal deliberations to draw a very, very clear line between Black, capital B, and African American. We got a lot of African Americans out here in the policy universe. We got a lot of African Americans out here in corporate spaces. You have a lot of African Americans out here who are doing well. What impresses me is when those people decide to identify as Black. I see Black as a political subdivision of African American, in which you are willing to say, I am okay, or even if you're not okay, I am for the liberation of marginalized people, regardless of what color they are. I recognize the pains and penalties of white supremacy, and I'm working to dismantle that for everybody, because it hurts everybody, including white people. And the politics, the electoral politics specifically, is but a narrow subset of what we should be doing. It's a major and significant subset, but it is but a subset of what we should be doing as people who identify politically as Black to dismantle white supremacy. So are we sharing power? Absolutely not, because people who have some materiality and some degree of comfort in this country who are African American, most of us don't identify as Black. So are those African Americans sharing power? Absolutely not. Or else they would have elected Kayla Reed potentate of our city, right? But we haven't. Why? because she is a self-identifying queer Black woman who's not willing to conform to the respectability politics of a Jimmy Edwards, who is much like myself, and I'm working to get over it, who is an extraordinarily patriarchal sexist with retrogressive ideas, who happens to have a melanated face. And that's why he finds safety and security among white power structures, right? That is why he is among those who are elevated to be a respected voice, right? Jimmy Edwards is a white man of Black people. And
okay, so I'm gonna take a moment here.
Oh no,
I dig it.
Cut that clip and put it out there. And that's just what it is. But until we have, but if you identify,
how do we combat that? So we know that some of us sit in our comfort or our fear, whoever they may be, right? And we know that there are people who don't have the luxury of time. Yeah. Whether that's because they don't have quality housing, they don't have food, they're over policed, a range of things. They don't have time. How do we train ourselves to check our privilege and share access? And I want to be fair. I'm saying this to the four of you the same way I said this to a white colleague. A gentleman who runs a big institution called me a couple of weeks ago, said, I love the idea of Black funders. How can we be of help? I took him to his own website. I showed him his list of funders. And then I told him about some of the institutional challenges those groups have had with racism, with gender bias, with access, right? And I said, if you don't do anything, you need to convince those people that they need to be willing to sit down with Black people that have a plan and work with them or get out of our way. Yeah. Right? So how do we do that internally?
That's for Kayla or
I can take a crack at that one. So we do need a Black agenda, and it needs to. We have several right now, and we need to collapse them into a shared Black agenda. There is a Black agenda that's sought to unseat Tashara Jones in August. That was a Black agenda.
And I would argue that that's an African American agenda.
Right. Okay. I appreciate and Blackness is not just contextualized to African Americans, right? It's diaspora, but it's political. I capitalize my B always because it is political as an identity that is based on it.
And I would even say
led initiative to unseat an incumbent, and I want to contextualize.
But I would even say, Kayla, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, that would be an anti-Black agenda, right?
I agree with that. Yeah. And I was about to contextualize why. Yeah. Because here we have one of the most name recognized elected officials in a seat as an incumbent. And when I first got into this game of politics, challenging an incumbent was already a problem. Challenging a Black incumbent, you were about to get pulled into the fire for even fixing your mouth to do that. But this is an incumbent who has been mostly aligned with the changes over the last 6 years and is challenged by a full slate of elected officials who are also African American. Why does this matter? Because there are conflicting agendas at play. Because there's one agenda that said, the mayor's race we lost by 888 votes. The person who was second to the mayor winning that is this person who's up for election. That makes her, by default, no personal opinion involved, by default, the person best suited to challenge one-on-one the city mayor. Let's challenge that person and put the entire Black African-American political establishment behind unseating her. Why? Because someone beyond that establishment, they didn't have their eyes just on the treasurer seat. They had their eyes on the mayor's seat. So if you hobble one in August, you get to walk into March better suited to lift up your person. These are conflicting ideas. And that is why mayors like Lyda Crewson, Other elected officials are able to slide in because there's not a time when we sit at the table until after the damage is done. This happened in 2017. It will happen again in 2021 because we do not have a shared agenda. But here's the thing. The shared agenda to me is not about who gets the seat. We cap power at representation, and that is not enough. That is insufficient. We stop looking at the North Star because we're so enamored by who's leading the line.
Right.
And they're leading us away from our collective vision for liberation or collective vision for power. And so we get caught up in, oh my God, the person in the front it looks like us. Now we don't know where we're going. Or they're intentionally taking us away from the visions that we need to have. We put a cap on it. Representation does not equal power. Representation does not equal access. Representation does not equal equity or equality. It doesn't equal justice. It is simply representation. There is someone who looks like me in that seat. They don't think like me. They don't believe like me. They don't have the same changes that I want to have. And we need to have an agenda that moves beyond representation, because that has failed St. Louis politics for the better part of 50 years.
And I assume if we have that agenda, then it doesn't matter what the
Can I
person looks like if we can compel them to do our work.
But I want to say something with what Kayla Reed is saying. I believe that you have to have elected officials. Like we had a circuit attorney's race that we had the powerful few who were trying to unseat an incumbent. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't run for these seats, but we also had an agenda that day one when I took office that I was told, if you do not basically give certain groups immunity from being investigated or potential charges, we're going to make sure you're not reelected when you run for reelection. And that's what I've had day one. And I think that we talk about, just a person in the seat, but we have to really talk about people who are elected by the people, who are following the will of the people, and you're doing what the people ask you to do, but everything is coming against you when you're doing the right thing that the people wanted you to do. And it's backlash that's insurmountable. I mean, you have backlash from people telling you you're not performing your job in your office, which is not true. You have people telling you what's in your office more than they don't even know your office, and that's unfounded. When you give information to combat lies and misinformation of a conviction rate of what you're doing, then it's still the lies continue with another agenda of someone else on the outside who's able to perpetuate lies. And we have to say that it's not just that individual who the people elect, but it's actually, we need people like Kayla Reed and others to advocate for that individual elected official who is doing the job for the people, to actually make sure that they have the ability to continue on with the agenda of the people, which is silenced all the time by the rhetoric and misinformation of the powerful few, which we're not talking about. I mean, when you have a president coming at you, when you have a senator coming at you, when you have a governor that's not been elected coming at you, and you have an attorney general, which is not elected, coming at you, and then you have people, we have the most aggressive, egregious police union in the city of St. Louis that is more powerful per Washington Post than most unions. And we have them coordinating and injecting themselves not in the employer-employee relationship, but in terms of politics and silencing the will of the people. When are we going to call out, like we're saying, the real power structure behind a Jeff Reuter? No one talks about that. Who was also, when I was a state representative, was the best friend and actually room with Eric Schmidt. So when he's talking about murder cases, he's not talking about murder cases because he cares about murder in the city of St. Louis. Those are often involved shooting cases that I will not close because I won't just paper review cases that I believe the investigation should be independent and give people, regardless of the outcome, true investigative justice, and looking at those cases and having a real look to making sure wherever decision we make, we give that to the people and the public, because it's about the integrity of the justice system. And so no one is talking about that. We have a powerful few in St. Louis where we're on the national stage right now about what's going on. We're this battleground of divisiveness and holding on a certain way. And we have to call it out. And we have to have people not afraid to call truth to power, because guess what? I'm not saying it, but somebody said they don't want to be like Kim Gardner. You got to say, what is that? And what's the reason for that? So when we talk about this courage, have the courage that in spite of people ruining your name, protesting outside your house, demonize you in every step of the way, saying they want to kill you, maim you, hurt you physically, because you're trying to do the right thing for the people. Have advocacy help protect that, not just because you agree with that person 100%, but understand what we're facing. We're facing taking this back to a way of life, and criminal justice reform is at a crossroads. And that's the number one issue that's driving voting in the country is police accountability. But we won't talk about that because police accountability will never be enacted in the state of Missouri if we have the same people leading the charge in the state house.
Yeah.
So I want to stay with you for a minute, Kim. You know, it's funny. So I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a good friend of Tashara, and it's funny. I've noticed that you and Tashara do something similar. If you go to your Facebook, you guys don't let people that bash you do that in silence, and your Facebook wall is a wall of letters with threats and accusations and just like really some of the most vile stuff I've ever read, you know. And I think about that a lot, and this idea in particular that Black women who are fearless and choose to be the face of change take a lot, you know. I'm mentioning you specifically because I saw that recently and it made me think of that in preparation for this. But to either of you, to you or Kayla, I like just, you know, your reaction to this idea that this is real, just strong, terrible kind of response to Black women daring to be the face of change, right?
I mean,
and also ask you the question is what do we do to support you?
I mean, first of all, you know, Black females are the most disrespected person in any movement. When you look at the civil rights movement and all the other movements, you know, we are the ones on the ground. We were the ones on the ground in activism. You see Kayla, you see Tashara, you see Congresswoman Cori Bush. I mean, you see the other reform-minded prosecutors in attacks. We are demonized and dehumanized in ways that even people in the same space, our male colleagues who share the same philosophy, and sometimes they are treated differently. And that's where we need people like yourself. It's not this, we're not victims of anything, but we need people to stand up and not be silent. And because what racism does, they want to isolate you and make you think that something's wrong with you. You've done something wrong.
Have you second guessing yourself,
dehumanizing you and terrorizing you, because you become so caught up in doing the work that you do not know that there are people that have ill intentions to actually physically harm you based off of a false narrative that a president, that a senator with a law license, by the way, which I don't know how he has one, by the attorney general with a law license that needs to lose it, as well as a governor who does not have a law license, to inject themselves to cause fear and racial divide. And no one is standing up what's right. What they choose to do is say, I am letting out looters and rioters lie. That I am somehow the cause of violent crime, which we know has existed in our city before I ever took office. And so when you have this narrative of fear and you have a African-American female in these positions that they feel comfortable with dehumanizing, because most good people fail to act and stand up. And that's not saying you got to agree with us, but when you have people saying that you should be hung by a tree by the KKK, you should be shot in your face, you should be dead and dragged in broad daylight, and the only thing left is the noose around your neck, when you're called all kind of words in and they mailing these letters to an office, and you have law enforcement sit up there and talk about, we want to really help about bringing communities together, when these same letters are turned over to law enforcement by probably Tashara too, and they tell me, I can't speak to Tashara, that this is public free speech. And I'm like, really? Hate speech is public violence against a certain individual is free speech? And they have their addresses on there. I'm not saying they're all real addresses, but it's just, we need people like yourself. We need philanthropy to really look at these campaigns, look at these organizations that help us do the work, the real work on the ground. We need to build a philanthropy base to really help heal communities and address the needs that we all know, as you heard, that we have to have an agenda of really truly being our brother's keeper. We have to put people in position to really speak to the people that elected them there, and they can hold them accountable and elect them out. But we have to do the work, and we have to have, have tough conversations with activists like Kayla Reed to tell us, hey, you're not doing this. We want to see this, and work together to try to have them tell us what they want to see, as well as work with them and how we can, continue to stay true to the people's agenda, which is important. We need all these people to come together to really help protect the ideas that all of us want to feel safe. We want to feel secure, and we want to have a way of life that we all deserve. It's sad that people talking about, in our comfort, I believe we're all in the same boat. We just fail to realize Donald Trump and his group is talking to a very small group of individuals that I never met, and we will never meet, because they're the top billionaires and whatever that I'm never going to know. He's not speaking to the everyday individual that we mistakenly believe in our head that we're somehow speaking to all of us. And we're all living in a way of life that we can do better, because if we come together, and racism has been the big black scar in the United States and around this country that we need to deal with. And now, because of activism and these young people out in the streets saying enough is enough with police brutality, and we continue to see these examples, when are we going to come together and have a plan like Kayla Reed is talking about to address these issues? And we have to stop saying it's not about political party, it's about doing the right thing. And if you're not doing the right thing, regardless of whether you're Republican, Independent, Green Party, whatever, Democrat, you need to get out of there, because people are tired of this divisive, racist rhetoric that we are perpetuating with this fear to keep things to in 1860 something, which I don't believe African Americans had a quality life back there that we all can speak of.
Again, so look, we are getting toward the end of our time, but I want to give each of you an opportunity to give kind of a closing thought. Actually, I'm looking forward to it.
I can go first.
Yes, ma'am.
So, part of the conversation that, we are trying to have at Action St. Louis is about at this intersection of the ways that we build power is to do deep base building, organizing around issues. We electoralize them, and we combat these structures that I mentioned early in the conversation, that we have to at all times be looking at how to move an individual from not being registered all the way to the polls, but how to create the system around them to make it easier for that person and more people to come into voting. What that looks like for us is that, yes, we do voter registration. That's what people love to fund, especially, 60 days out. We do voter registration, we do voter turnout, but we also talk to people between elections. And we've grown that at scale. In 2018, when we ran a voter program for the August election in St. Louis County, we knocked on about 7,000 doors. For the August election in St. Louis City in 2020, we knocked over 40,000.
Wow.
We had a team of 50 Black folks who we were paying $15 an hour to knock doors, to make calls, to send texts. We usually have events. People know us for our brunches. We had a forum for the circuit attorney's race with Circuit Attorney Gardner and Mary Pat Carl. It was 2 hours. Over 21,000 people watched it in the first day. Wow. Our work in this, we have a 501c3 and a 501c4. Our C3 work is to do education, and is to do deep engagement, and it is to do issue-based work. When we talk about an agenda, Action St. Louis, organizations like it, are working together around tables, putting forth an agenda. What we need from Black funders, from Black donors, is to make commitments to the giving circles and can make commitments to the organizations for a period of time. We cannot rely on grants to build Black political power. That will always never be enough resources there. We need to have the ability to have unrestricted general operating support to build the work. I'll give one example before I close. There is no grant that is helping to combat the issues around evictions right now in the city of St. Louis. There is no funding for that someplace that I can go look. But that issue is impacting Black people. It's going to disproportionately impact Black mothers who have children, who are virtual learning, who are service workers, who are, lower income workers. And there needs to be an organization that is combating that on the policy front and doing education to connect people to resources. That is something that Action St. Louis wants to do. That is something that we are doing another touch of the census work as a part of our civic engagement work, because it has to happen. And so for us, when we talk to, this group, which I think is a powerful idea to bring together a giving circle and to give it to Black organizations fighting for racial equity, we're going to have to make a commitment. Bring us in for one-on-one conversations to give you the agenda, commit to the agenda, not just as an organization, but as individuals. Have these conversations in your other circles, bring people in. Action St. Louis is a member organization. You can be a member of Action St. Louis and still be a donor. We give a lot of prestige to funding and philanthropy. It is something that I think is really important, but it's something that we all have to do. I give, and I ask for a lot of money because I'm an executive director, and I have a portfolio in which I've given money because we all have to we have to be moving on all those fronts. So I'm excited to work, more closely with the Giving Circle here in St. Louis. I think it's a fantastic idea, and what I'll say is we're 70 days out from an election that has epic implications, not just the White House. We're talking about the governor's mansion. We're talking about the way our maps will be drawn. We are talking about our voting systems here locally. We are talking about judges in our community, down ballot work. And Action St. Louis is hyper focused on the down ballot work. So much to the point that the number one issue in the state that was voted on was Medicaid expansion in August. More than people who voted for all the Republican nominees for governor and all the Democrat nominees for governor combined. More people voted for Medicaid expansion because grassroots organizations are doing the down ballot work. And that's the work that we need to continue to do. And that's the work that we need supported. So I do hope that we can have your support over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Don?
So I think I talked about some ideas that seem perhaps diametrically opposed. We talked about voting and engaging within the system, and we've also talked about having the audacity to imagine something new. And it seems like these things are opposite, but I would argue that they are not. I think that all of us who are of means, whether that be financial or energy or breath in your body, and B, of good conscience, meaning you have a will and a spirit to want to see people free, want to see us as a world move towards something better than where we are now. I think that all of us have some obligation to make these two opposites, treat these two imposters the same, as Rudyard Kipling would say. Work within this space while having the courage to imagine something else. As a matter of fact, you have to maintain and eventually increase your position in this space, in this system that we have now. And I would argue that it's the two-party system. We should be pushing Democrats left. We should be, as Cori Bush, we should be doing what Cori Bush did. We should be doing what AOC is doing. We should be doing what Bernie Sanders is doing, working within this current system and maintaining and increasing our position in this current system in order to push the entire current structure to having the discussions, to having the courage to have the discussions that we could reimagine and we could create something better. I don't think that those two concepts are opposite. I also think that there's a role for everybody. If you are willing to accept that we can make these two opposite interests or seemingly opposite interests live in harmony with each other, then I think that there's a role for everybody within that structure. There's a role for the activist. There's a role for the lawyer. There's a role for the teacher. There's a role for the artist. There's a role for the homeless person. There's a role for the elder. There's a role for the youth. And I think that is how we get to a better place. That is how we pursue not only electoral, but economic and frankly, just humane justice. That is how we push all of us toward a better place. But we do have to have the courage, like all of our ancestors did. And even though our current situation is entirely imperfect, we do all have to have the courage and maintain the courage once you get to positions of power to imagine a more just world, to imagine a more righteous world, and to frankly imagine something better than all of us have seen.
I agree. So we're heading to the time. Man, this did not disappoint. I really appreciate you guys doing this. There'll be more webinars in the future. I just want to acknowledge also that our brother Rasheen is hard at work in Jeff City, so he couldn't make it today. But I do want to thank you for everything that you've shared. I've encouraged anybody who's watching this live here on YouTube or will eventually see the recording to look these folks up, man. They're kind of a big deal. And the amount of commitment and authenticity, that exists in you guys is really apparent in everything that you say. So I appreciate you taking the time. For everybody that's on the call, the next webinar is the power of giving. We'll have a national roundtable. I think it's the first time it's ever been done. Black-led giving circles from across the United States. It's going to be fantastic. You can find information about it on the website. We will have a funding cycle this year, so stay tuned about that as well. And just again, thank you for everybody for joining us. Appreciate you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
the
having me.
opportunity. Thank you. Thank everybody.
Thank you all. Bye.